In today's episode, isolation, me understanding productivity and what it actually requires, as well as some other things if we get onto them. So, isolation, is it a bad thing? On the whole, yes, probably. There's a lot going wrong with isolation. It leads to increased mental health problems, it increases many things that we don't particularly want. However, with that being said, there is a use for it, and I think it's important that we acknowledge it. At this period in my life, I'm at uni, and no one is here, so we are alone, all alone. There's no one in my flat, which means it's an ideal time to start using these periods of isolation for better and not using them for, well, unproductive things. So, for instance, we can talk about the fact that in a lot of cultures, coming of age ceremonies utilize a long period of isolation, and the reason for this is fundamentally important because it allows, well, new adults, old children, to make sure that they're actually reaching maturity. Isolation has that as one of its big purposes. It allows us all to find who we truly are. It allows us to become self-sufficient. It allows us to have a place where we can actually introspect, and that is something of fundamental importance. So, overall, it's something that we should probably use a little bit more of, or for some people, a little bit less. That's a completely subjective thing, and you can say for yourself whether you need more or less of it. But how do we actually do this? I'm still figuring it out, is the honest answer. There has been periods in my life where I have been isolated heavily, and then there has also been periods where I have had no isolation. It's a fine balance and it's hard to find it. However, you can find it. Things like holidays, retreats to log cabins, things like that are typically a good start. However, for a lot of people, that is inaccessible, whether that be for professional commitments, time commitments, or economic commitments. Obviously, hiring a log cabin could be very expensive. So there's a problem with that. And the other large scale problem that we're seeing is that fundamentally people struggle to be alone, and even with the chance to be alone, there is things like our phones, like this, emails, Slack channels. Everything that we have is meant for us to communicate, and that can be problematic because how can we be alone if there is a constant ding of things that we need to do? We can't. As my grandmother says, if we was meant to communicate all the time, we would have antennas sticking out of our heads, to paraphrase. That is not exactly what she says. She uses a different body part, but we're not going to go there. So overall, we should isolate ourselves more. However, why bother is the big thing here. And what should you actually do when you are isolating yourself? The first and foremost obvious thing to do is read or work. Sometimes isolation can be really good for things like work. A lot of writers, me myself, I use isolation as a way to be able to work more. I am free from the distractions of mainstream society. I'm free from the distractions of everything, and it allows me to focus. It is a ritualistic thing for a lot of knowledge workers. So that's the most obvious use of it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the best use of it. Writing is a good use. However, the type of writing you're doing is also going to be of fundamental importance to making this period of isolation worthwhile. And the reason that is because we could potentially use more of journaling, and I don't particularly like talking about this subject because it's a very oversaturated subject. Everyone talks about journaling, but if you do it right, it can be a tool that's useful. You need to ask yourself the important questions, and what I mean by that is not the fluffy questions of who do you want to be, because that seriously helps no one. Because no one has a clue, and trying to answer that question is massively arrogant. Because with years of introspection, with years of inner work, with years of actually trying to understand that question, people still don't know. People get to 80, 90, and they don't truly know really what they want to be. So expecting yourself to be able to answer that question just because you have a pen in your hand and a moleskin book it's a silly idea, and it's not going to work. But what you can do is a few other things. Gratitude journaling can help. I don't use it myself. I am a somewhat grateful person, but the problem with gratitude journaling is the people it will help the most are ungrateful and probably don't want to realize that. So if you think that maybe gratitude journaling isn't for you, you're probably wrong. You could probably utilize it. It will probably allow you to, first of all, be happier. That's one of the best things for gratitude is in our lives. They're not actually as bad as we think they are. When we have a problem, it feels like it's the end of the world and it's only happening to us. But the good news is everyone feels like that all of the time. Everyone feels their problems are unique. They're not. Everyone experiences them. And that's normal. It's part of life. It is not a bug. It's a feature. And it's important to understand that. So that's why gratitude journaling can be very helpful. It can draw you to things that you've never seen before or taken much notice of. If you go for a walk every morning and you walk past trees and hedgerows and you listen to wildlife, that's something a lot of people in this world do not get to experience. And maybe taking 2 minutes to pay attention to that could be important. Ooh. But if you don't want to do that, there are some things you can do. So a couple of practices that I like, and yes, the root of all of these questions is who do you want to be? But obviously we can't ask ourselves that question in such a harsh form because we can't answer it in such a harsh form. So if you want your son to describe you as one thing when you die, what actually is it? This is a big question because it forces you to reflect on your fundamental values. And for a lot of people, that's a scary idea. Most people don't have fundamental values. They kind of go through life winging it. And there isn't anything wrong with that per se, but fundamental values could be a beneficial thing to have, and we will come on to them in a lot more detail later. But as an extended practice of this question, and I can't remember who I heard this from, but I think it might have been potentially in the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But to write your personal eulogies. This is something I've done myself, and I found it to be extremely helpful in writing your personal eulogy is a good activity. It's an extremely beneficial activity if you do it in enough detail and you allow yourself to be creative enough. In a lot of these journaling tasks, we have, at least I do, the proclivity to over-rationalize our answers. And that's the worst thing we could possibly do because it doesn't allow for that inner exploration that journaling is facilitating. If you keep rationalizing your answers to these questions, you're never going to get anywhere because you're not allowing your subconscious to flow through yourself. You're simply saying what you think is acceptable for yourself, and that is based upon hundreds of factors like what society expects of you, what your parents expected of you when you were 4. It is comprised of a whole list of factors that you can't possibly take into account. So over-rationalizing these answers isn't a good idea. So write and don't think. That's a very hard thing to do, I will admit that, but it's a thing that could be very beneficial if you simply write your answer to these questions or write your personal eulogy without thinking too much about it. And then once you've done that, at least in regards to your personal eulogies, write them for every role that you have. So if you're a father, if you're a business owner, if you're an employee, whatever you are, write how you want to be remembered. within that role. And what you'll find if you write enough, and when I say write for this, I don't mean a couple of paragraphs, I mean pages. You want the eulogy to be as if someone truly loved you and truly wanted to write it for you. It's self-indulgent, of course it is, but the more you write, the less you'll be able to fight the subconscious that is trying to get things on paper for you and help you find it. So that's one thing you could potentially ask yourself. Another question is, if money were no object and you didn't have the restraints of things like family ties and professional obligations, what is it you would do tomorrow? Once again, don't over-rationalize your answer here. The important thing to do is, with this, a lot of people feel as though they want to make £1 million a month, or they want to run the next $1 billion company. And in all honesty, you probably don't. The problems that are attached to admiring people like Elon Musk is that, yes, you could be like him, but he also has his bad traits, just like everyone else. You could admire these people, but you don't necessarily want to have them problems. I know I don't. Everyone has a number, and it is a case of figuring that number out. Because the first one that pops into your head, it might be right. You might have a good intuition about these things, but it's likely not. So, what is it that you would do tomorrow if there was no restraints? And finally, another question that I like to ask myself, not just in journaling, but all the time, and it's something I like to reflect on, is what is it that you're truly scared of? And for a lot of people, this will be a surface level answer like spiders. I'm petrified of them. Heights. Not necessarily heights that you'll die from, but be paralyzed for that. That seems to be a worse alternative, at least for me. But your fear is an extremely good compass. If you're scared of it, you should probably do it. I was talking to a client the other day about this, and there was something she really wanted to do, but because of personal experiences, such things like that, she was petrified of doing it. However, if you're petrified of doing something, it means you should be doing it. It means you care about it enough to be scared of it. The general rule is, if you're not scared, you don't care, so don't do it. But if you are scared, follow that fear, because dealing with fear is a skill that will get better with time. The first time I filmed a video, I was petrified. I still am scared filming videos, and especially posting them. The idea that someone may sit here and watch this is still scary as sorts, but it's a fear that's worth dealing with. So dealing with fear is not just something that you do or don't do. It's a skill that increases over time the more you do it. Fear never goes away, but your ability to deal with it increases. So overall, just to reiterate them questions in a short format. If you were to describe if you want your son to describe you as one thing when you die, or let's try that again. How do you want your son or your daughter or your friend to describe you when you die? If money were no object and you didn't have the restraints of things like family ties and professional obligations, what is it that you would do tomorrow? And what is it that you truly fear? Now, on to me. After we've discussed some questions that may or may not give you an existential crisis, why am I talking about this? Well, my name is Alex, obviously. If you looked on my channel, that was fairly self-explanatory. I am a law student, and I also run 2 businesses. So I feel I have at least somewhat in the way of legitimacy of being able to talk about things that I have personally done myself, and some of those things are understanding productivity and teaching people how to become more productive, understanding knowledge, more importantly, understanding how to learn properly. I am and have been for a while now a tutor for GCSE and A-level students, and a good one. at that. So I understand knowledge, I understand productivity, and I understand what it's like to have to develop a lot in a short space of time. I came to uni somewhat well equipped due to the good job of my parents, but I still didn't have a clue. And as much as I have mixed views on university, for a lot of people I feel like it's a waste of time. I think if you want to become a professional, i.e. a doctor, a lawyer, something like that, it's a very good thing. If you want to become a business owner, don't do a business degree, start a business. It's not worth it. Apprenticeship is far more. And I don't mean apprenticeship in the form of like government apprenticeships. I mean the form of learning in the field and doing it. Because even with law in a classroom is vastly different to law in a courtroom or law in a solicitor's office. So if you're one of the few people that want to be a professional and aren't just going to uni because alcohol's cheap in SU bars, it's a good thing. But I think the best thing for everyone is to leave home as soon as possible. And I know I'm in a privileged position to say that because I know just how expensive house prices are. But with that being said, if you can leave home and enter a period somewhat of isolation, it will do you the world of good. So the Sunday syllabus is more so an opportunity for me to do a weekly review in public. I don't expect anyone to actually watch it, but it's a way for me to increase my efficiency with communication and talk with more fluency, and to actually be able to think about my ideas. I collect a lot of information week in, week out, doing what I do, and a lot of it gets lost. So the idea of putting it in a reasonably short format for potentially someone to consume if they might find it meaningful or helpful is a good thought for me. So that's why I'm doing this. So if you enjoy it, you enjoy it. So that's me. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is productivity. That is somewhat of a taboo word because everyone seems to talk about it and no one seems to know exactly what it is. I don't know either. I'll cut to the chase, but I can have a pretty good guess. So this morning, actually, I was listening to the Modern Wisdom podcast, the newest episode with Cal Newport. I love Cal Newport. I think his ideas are brilliant. And he mentioned the idea that the general approaches to productivity for at least the last 70 years have been bad at best. They're based upon manufacturing values. They're based upon how efficiency is described on a what's the word? They're based upon how the construction of Ford Model Ts are and how quickly they're done. They're based upon how many units of hours, how many units per hour can one produce. And knowledge work can't be done like that. And there has been, admittedly, many attempts to at least somewhat define productivity, and I think there's been good ones. But overall, productivity is, first of all, it's an extremely subjective experience, and that is an obvious thought. What is productive for me may not be productive for you. However, I think there is one underlying logical conclusion about productivity, and it is, in some respects, based upon that production per hour definition, but I think it goes further than that. I think it's the amount of tasks you complete that have a direct correlation to progress towards meaningful goals. And that is a very simplistic definition. But it's not so much the amount of tasks you get done, and I know that was a blatant contradiction, but simply getting tasks done is not being productive, that's just being busy. Anyone can create a to-do list of 200 items and the majority of them are trivial. but it's very hard to make concrete, consistent progress towards a very clearly defined goal. And there's a couple of reasons why. Most people aren't 100% clear on goals. And that's an understandable experience. Goal setting is extremely hard and it's an ongoing process for many. It's an ongoing process for me. No one truly figures it out what they actually want in life. But basing productivity off of that is a good idea. Simply getting tasks done for the sake of a boss who tells you to, yes, it may be a part of a job and you may have to, but it isn't necessarily productivity. Productivity must be rooted in a value system. And value systems are something that I have spent a lot of time thinking about. And for me, a value system is much like a constitution, much like a country's constitution. Not so much America or many codified constitutions, and I think there's a distinction to be drawn here. A constitution should be living. Now, this isn't a political comment. I don't think living constitutions are always a good idea. They result in lots of bad things. Just look at Britain. But having a personal constitution is important because in a way we can function much like a country. We have to make changes regularly. But if we make too many changes, this is going to lead to bad things. If we can make changes, especially significant changes to our lives, that aren't well thought out and aren't based upon some underlying guiding principle, you're going to end up getting lost very, very fast. So, for me, my personal constitution is written exactly like a constitution, and because it's a subjective experience, that is value systems. It was easiest for me to write it with articles and sub-articles and to essentially view my values as something that can be documented in that manner. So, following from that, when you're writing your value systems, you need to be very careful about what you put down on paper, because what you write is going to manifest itself somehow in your life. So, before you write, think. Don't just, brainstorm prior to writing it. But when you open that document and you want something concrete down, you need to think very carefully about it. That isn't to say you should be scared to write anything, because, like I said, amending your personal constitution is doable. It should be difficult, but doable. Now, as well as this, there should be consequences for breaking your constitution. There should be consequences for making decisions that go against your guiding principles. There will be natural consequences. And oftentimes, there does not need to be deliberate punishment for going against it. And that's simply because there will be a natural punishment. If part of your value system is to not be reactive, as it is part of mine, and I find myself being reactive, there is a natural consequence to that. And it's normally that people get very annoyed with me and I get in an argument and waste loads of time, which is not ideal for anyone. So, in the absence of a natural punishment, there should be a punishment for yourself, and that doesn't mean to look at this in a self-deprecating way, far from it, but to look in it as a manner of restorative justice as such, and approach it in a way that's not so much making you feel bad about breaking a rule, but approaching it in a manner that's, why did I break a rule and how can I not do it in the future? Because we're not trying to enforce a penal system on yourself for breaking a rule that you set for yourself arbitrarily. That's the last thing we're trying to do. But what we are trying to do is make sure that you can learn from your mistakes, because that is ultimately the only way you're going to get closer to doing what you want to do. So, that was a little tangent into value systems, but using value systems for productivity requires visitation of it on a regular basis. I do this once a week in my weekly review. So after I film this, I will take a look at my value system and I will plan for next week and make sure every single task that I have set for the next week is fundamentally in line with what my life should be, at least how I've designed my life to be at this point. And this means that your task execution, it may be lower. And this is something that Cal Newport also talks about in, I haven't read it yet, and I will be reading it soon, but in Slow Productivity, is the idea that getting more done is not necessarily a good thing. The quality, as we all know, quality over quantity. I think that statement is flawed somewhat, but we'll go into that another day. Extremely goal-driven behavior is going to cause you to execute far less, but it's going to cause you to execute far less, but more meaningfully. You're going to do things that are actually worth the time doing it. And that's something we all need to do more. A lot of us waste our time procrastinating. My face is a brilliant example. I had facial hair yesterday and I didn't want to do my work, so I shaved into a baby face, and now I look 12. I should have consulted my value system, but in all honesty, it says nothing about shaving my facial hair because that wasn't a problem I saw coming. That wasn't a method of procrastination I'd used before. But extreme goal-driven behavior is brilliant. Now, another thing I want to touch on is productivity, and the fact that most productivity advice you listen to is good, but only when circumstances you are in are optimal. Sure, you can get your red light exposure every night, but you can't do that if you're on the way to the hospital because your partner's there. You can't do that if you are traveling all the time. You can maybe bring a portable red light, that's a possibility. But the main point I'm trying to illustrate here is that optimization specifically, optimization for the purpose of productivity, needs to be viewed in a slightly different manner. There's an idea I'm playing with currently, which is optimization in the trenches as opposed to the HQ. Most advice we have is all about optimization in privilege, not privileged in the left-right political sense, but privileged in the sense where there's no ongoing issues stopping you. And that isn't the right way to view optimization because it's not helpful. Anyone can work well in optimal conditions. Anyone. You need to be able to optimize to work well in bad conditions. That means you need to be able to work in the middle of a hospital waiting room. And this is something I found out myself the hard way a few weeks ago. You have to be able to work in a manner where you can work anywhere. And that's something that's really important to get good at. If you can't work anywhere, you can't work at all. So, the way in which we do this is difficult because I can't prescribe to you a solution for why you can't work when you don't get 8.2 hours of sleep. But what I can do is tell you to stop focusing on the 8.2 hours of sleep. That is the ideal. You're not going to get that. You can still work without it. And this is something that has come up a lot recently. I've heard a lot of people talking about it. And it's the idea of not, I say a lot of people, I mean 2 podcasters, is not checking your sleep trackers straight away in the morning. I'm guilty of it. I am anally retentive about my sleep trackers. I'm awful. They must be over 85% minimum, which is a hard task to achieve. But with that being said, don't be like me, and don't check it every morning when you wake up, because it will, if you're not a strong enough person, dictate your day. And if it says you had a 60% sleep efficiency, you'll have a terrible day, simply because you're dictated by a number on the screen that is probably fairly inaccurate. So your optimization should be focused upon having you being able to work anywhere under any stress, which means having goal-driven behavior, because you need to be able to cut out the things that don't serve you and not have to spend 4 hours of your 6 hours of time where you could be productive focusing on something that you could either delegate to someone else or just simply drop. You need to be goal-driven. Now, when it does come to optimization, I will talk about it very briefly. Sleep, this is your number one priority. You must have regulated circadian rhythms. At this point, I'm sure everyone knows this. Everyone's seen some Andrew Huberman clip of him discussing it. Now, to illustrate the importance of sleep, there have been a few meta-analyses done of people ending their lives. And if you track their circadian rhythms in the days leading up to that event, they are almost reversed. So if you don't focus on your sleep, and I know for shift workers, this is an impossible thing to balance. And if there are any of my clients watching, I'm sorry, Matt, but it is something that you have to figure out how to do. And if you are a shift worker, I'm not going to give you advice because I'm still figuring it out for my clients. I have done it myself. I've worked shifts, and there are very few good ways of doing it. There is a reason why the WHO classifies shift work as a health risk, because from personal experience, it very much is. But another thing you can do with sleep is red lights. Now, when we think red lights, we think primarily red light therapy, and it's a good idea. But even if you don't have access to red light, as in infrared red light, still sit in red light. It's important you do this prior to sleeping because of the way in which you recognize that color. First of all, there's the obvious reason that it limits literal blue light exposure. The rays from the light are not blue in the most simplest explanation. But also, there is very little difference between dark and red. That's why brake lights are red, not just because red means stop. It's because when someone flashes their brake lights at you, it doesn't make you blink like a white light would. So sitting in red light is an important thing for sleep if you need to be doing things like reading prior to sleep, and which is one thing I would advocate for, is read a little bit of something prior to sleeping. Now, another thing is nutrition. Nutrition is very, very important. One thing I will say is do not eliminate carbs. I have heard a lot of people recently talking about eliminating carbs in their diet to streamline their productivity. And whilst things like blood sugar spikes can cause drowsiness and such, it's important to understand that if you completely eliminate carbs, you're not going to be able to think. To the same token, do not limit fats. I learned this the hard way recently because I stupidly didn't track my fat intake clear enough, and sitting at 20 grams of fat a day, even for someone who is in a deficit because I'm prepping for a show, well, I'm not prepping for a show because I will be prepping for a show in like a year and a bit, so I need to get lean prior to an off season. 20 grams of fat is not enough for anyone, and you will feel terrible. You will feel like you are sad all the time, and there is various reasons for this I'm not going into, but you need to make sure that you're getting your carbs. The one thing I will say with carbs is limit the portion size, do not limit the total grams, and spread them evenly throughout the day, and that way you won't have such a bad blood sugar spike. Another thing which I don't often hear talk about in terms of nutrition is squeeze your meals in early. At least for me, it helps my sleep. As long as I'm eating before 4 o'clock, I will sleep well. 3 o'clock seems to be the ideal for sleeping at 8:30. So 5 hours, I would say, is the Goldilocks zone. But that is, of course, subjective. You'll have to trial and error to figure out for yourself. Now, one other thing with optimization is socialization. And this is something that I don't know if I've heard anyone talk about. Whilst this is in contrast to me saying that isolation is something good, I also think socialization is just as good, just as important. If you don't socialize, you're not going to work well. There's two reasons for this. If you completely deprive yourself of anything you enjoy, your life's just going to suck, and what's the point in making a load of money? There is no point. And second of all, if you don't go out, you're probably a boring person, or at least not exposing yourself to new stimuli, which means you're going to end up being boring, and no one likes boring people. And finally, no one listens to boring people. So especially if you're a creative, especially if you're a creator of some sort, you need to socialize, and that needs to be a priority twice a week at least. For me, twice is my go-to. Obviously, this is subjective. Like everything I'm saying, you have to figure it out for yourself. There's no point listening to a guide and taking the advice as prescription, because it's not. Everyone differs, everyone needs to figure it out for themselves. Following on from boring people, do you know what isn't boring? People with qualities that are direct opposites to each other. So, for instance, someone who is extremely organised but does things sporadically. Seem like they don't exist, don't they? But they do. Them qualities work extremely well together. And there is a good reason for this. So, picture someone who has a brilliant organisation system for their knowledge, but they have the trait of spontaneity. They consistently do things on a whim. Now, for someone who has a really organised knowledge system, this seems like a stupid thing to do. But when you think about it, it actually makes a lot of sense. Because someone who is extremely organised, at least with their knowledge, can make decisions on a whim confidently. Because they don't really have to think about what they're doing, because, well, the organisation of their knowledge is so good that they understand it, and their intuitive decisions that are based upon that knowledge are normally going to be right. So whilst they do have two directly opposing characteristics of spontaneity and extreme organisation, it works well together. So this is something that, for instance, Andy Warhol, you can see in his interviews. If you read or watch any of his interviews, specifically the transcripts are quite funny actually. He is an extremely talented artist, but his interviewing skill is not bad. I wouldn't put it bad, but his interviewing skill is nondescript. He says very little. He doesn't really talk about his work. It's not of a priority to him. At least it appears in his interviews. And of course, there's reasons for this. His art speaks for itself, primarily. He doesn't need to answer questions. But his almost non-verbal, non-explanatory nature is directly juxtaposed to his expressive art, to how he expresses himself. So he is non-expressive and expressive simultaneously. And that's something that I think we all need to cultivate within ourselves, is identify characteristics that we have that we should cultivate the direct opposite of. So for me, that is my organisation. I am an extremely organised person. Everything I do is rigid, not flexible, which can lead, if you're not careful, to stagnation. People who are extremely organised often procrastinate. They often don't get anything done for fear that their organisational system may break, and I am one of those people. So, to balance that, to offset it, I make decisions occasionally on a whim. I do things that are not thought through, that are unorganised. I have what I like to call periods of violence and periods of peace. Then periods of peace are helpful. That's when everything in your life is optimised. That's when your organisational systems are perfectly intact. But it's also when things tend to get boring. And boring, like I said, doesn't produce great work. So sometimes you need to be violent, you need to break things, you need to become unorganised and spontaneous. And you need to have these attributes coexist together. I'm not telling you to completely one day a week every month to throw your organizational system out the window and just do whatever you want. That's the last thing I'm saying. But what I am saying is occasionally bear in mind that if you become extremely rigid to one attribute that you have, you will stagnate, and you need to include variety to actually make progress. So cultivating, juxtaposing qualities is something I feel is important, but it's obviously hard and it requires introspection. And when's the best time to introspect? When you're isolated. So overall, I think it's important that, to sum up everything that we've discussed, it's important to isolate at times, not always, but enough to introspect, enough to understand yourself on a deeper level. It is also important to understand that productivity isn't about what you do when everything is easy, when you're in your optimal state of living. That isn't productivity. Productivity is what you get done in a goal-directed manner in periods where it's not easy to get it done. That should be the focus of where you direct your efforts towards increasing your skill of productivity towards. Because productivity is a skill in some way. If you don't practice it, you will get worse at it. If you do practice it and you focus on making it a better skill, if you focus on implementing practices and techniques that will make you better in suboptimal environments, your skill of productivity will flourish and it will increase, and you will find you get so much more done. And finally, value systems. Everything that we do should be centered around a value system, and you need to cultivate that value system as your personal constitution, as a mission statement for yourself. Without it, you can't really be productive. And without it, you can't really get anywhere. So do not ignore the importance of a value system in your life. And that is all for this week.